Hi everyone. My name is Kwong Lee. I'm the director of Deptford X here in South London. Um, Welcome to Sonya Dyer, one of our commissioned artists for Deptford X Festival this year. Sonya's audio work, Catching Feels, is online right now through our SoundCloud and at three listening stations at Lewisham Art House, Art Hub at Mornington site, and also at our festival hub at Studio 101 on the High Street, Deptford High Street here. So it's really good to have this opportunity to talk with you a little bit about your work, about this commission here, um, and yeah, to share that with the listening public. So it's all about listening today. Um, so Sonia, firstly, what is your inspiration for the work Catching Feels?
Thanks, Quan. I think it was a mixture of things happening at the same time. In general, I'm thinking a lot about this idea of polycrisis, of multiple crises happening at the same time, and in particular, um, the likelihood of climate collapse. Um, and I'm also thinking about the urban environment and what it is to experience um, phenomenal change within the urban environment and what that might be like for us moving forward. And then partly it's inspired by my field trips to Deptford and my experience of just walking around the neighborhood and experiencing um, the specificity of the environment. I work not far from there, but I rarely go into Deptford. I kind of go into New Cross and go home. So it was good for me to spend time just walking the streets and experiencing the neighborhood itself. Um, I wanted to make a work that was um, infused with Deptford, but not necessarily about Deptford. So not explaining Deptford to itself,
Hmm.
but just coming out of my experience of spending time there.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Um, just on a kind of, because I know you think about time, and I think there's time references in there, and
Mm.
and you mentioned that it's not specifically about Deptford. What about time? Were you thinking of time in terms of time that is now, the present, or were you relating to something that is in the future and in the past?
In my work, I'm really interested in collapsing time. So the idea that of past, present, future kind of existing
Mm,
in the same space. So in the work, there are moments where the narration is in that present moment, and then it's also anticipating a possible future, but also reflecting on historical characters or um, at one point I mentioned the East India Company, for example.
mm,
But I didn't want it to be a kind of historical tour through Deptford. So although I mention certain individuals, I don't actually name them. It's the kind of thing where uh, if a listener wanted to, they could go off and kind of have their own journey in finding the names of certain people. I guess I'm more interested in just evoking time in in different ways. But also I'm aware that this is a 5 minute
mm.
piece, so it actually doesn't last long in terms of its own duration. But within that 5 minutes, I wanted to pack in these multiple timelines.
I really admire that because I think it's when I'm listening to it, even though, as you say, it's 5 minutes, just over 5 minutes, I feel like it. And I mentioned to you already that I listen to it on the loop, and it makes sense to do on the loop rather than obviously listening to a straightforward narrative, obviously sort of start, middle, end kind of thing. So it shifts kind of my focus on what I'm listening to and all these things. So that's really, yeah, this time and also place, time and place was also I was thinking of, not just here, but yes, different locations that you mentioned in your narrative. Um,
Yeah, and I think I was interested in the sense of the experiential. So thinking about the idea of someone listening to it wearing headphones and the intimacy of headphones. And then thinking about what the experience of, in the editing process, we added sounds of insects or the sounds of a car passing or various sounds that you associate with different parts of the story.
Mm,
And yeah, I thought a lot about this idea of the experiential and what it is to experience time in this sense. Um, I'm one of those people who walks around with headphones all the time. And when I don't wear headphones, it's a very different experience of walking through the city than when I do.
mm. Yeah, that really comes across. Um, I also want to ask you, how does Catching Fields relate to your previous work, if it does at all?
I think it relates to the work that I'm making now and the work that I've started to make over the last few years. So I tend to work maybe for a decade on a body of work. And the work kind of manifests in different iterations in different ways. Usually I work with moving image and sculpture, but really I'm interested in storytelling in a sense.
Mm,
Um, so for 8 or 9 years, I was working on this project called Hailing Frequencies Open, which is much more about kind of science and science fiction and these kind of hidden narratives of various Black women who were kind of fictional and also real life people. Whereas the last few years, I've been thinking and working more and more on this question of like climate emergency and polycrisis, and thinking a lot about this idea of like post-scarcity and what that might mean, which is a very kind of it's an idea that is probably most popularized via Star Trek, in a sense that Star Trek exists within a post-scarcity landscape where nobody actually works for money because money doesn't exist.
mm,
You run a restaurant because you like cooking and you like hosting people. So recently I was commissioned to make a sculpture for the box in Plymouth, which is called Hybrida Compositor, which is currently on display in Plymouth and will come to London this autumn. And it's inspired by the forms of various extinct or near extinct marine specimens. So creating this kind of hybrid creature that is made up of parts of other creatures that no longer exist or are greatly imperiled. And then last year, I made a film with a writer called River Solomon for the Lass Arts Foundation in Berlin, which is called Portals. And that film is inspired by the idea of the Mediterranean as this route, this kind of portal between like Africa and Europe, and thinking through migration and the type of migration that has been prompted by polycrisis, by emergency from south to north. I'm thinking about that body of water in a way to which, the Atlantic has been quite mythologized in terms of thinking through the transatlantic triangle. And my idea is that actually that story now has been transposed to the Mediterranean. And for this century,
mm.
Mediterranean is going to be that place. But all of these things are precipitated by climate collapse, and the fact that what we call the global south hasn't actually caused these problems, but
Mm.
is having to deal with them most severely and having to deal with them first. Um, so in that sense, Catching Fields is a part of this body of work that is a couple of years in and many more years to go in the future in terms of my practice.
I really like the fact that to hear an artist talk about work that takes that time to, because in some sense it's really intriguing, but also it feels like more real in terms of investigation into something that has a kind of social and cultural connection with us as
Mm.
um, people who make contact with the work itself, kind of thing. So it's not something. It's very different to say a consumerist kind of way of consuming art or experiencing art. So this, I like the way you talk about making the work, but also how we are part of the experience of the art itself, and not just something that is kind of passive, or either way, the art object and the viewer seems to have an active engagement. Um,
Mm.
the words that you use, like polycrisis and obviously climate collapse, all these things that are very real to us. I think you mentioned in your it reminds me, you mentioned in your piece that climate change, the term was created by a politician or a somebody who kind of wrapped it up so that it's more palatable kind of thing. Do you want to say something about the
Yeah.
contrast of, what we're experiencing, and also how we are being sort of, so people are just skating over it a little bit kind of thing?
Yeah, it's actually popularized by a guy called Frank Lutz, who's a pollster. He's a Republican pollster in the States. He often appears on Newsnight
Right.
over here as well. And yeah, he kind of invented this phrase as a way of referencing um, what we used to call global warming, but making it less alarming. And so it's a phrase that was, tested to see if they could find something that was palatable, a palatable way of talking about it, because it feels kind of passive. It feels as if it's something that would happen anyway,
Mm,
like things change, right? Um, and so in that sense, it's a deeply political phrase, which we've all just been conned into using as
mm,
if it were somehow scientific. And actually, it's a result of a political process. And I think in a way where we're living in the aftermath and the wake of that popularization, because there is a distinct lack of urgency,
mm.
particularly in the northern part of our planet. And I think that's in large part because we're not really dealing with um, the full extent of what's happening yet.
Yeah,
What we are dealing with is the people who are dealing with it, who then are pushed up here and are then treated as the problem, whereas the
yeah,
problem was actually what caused them to have to leave where they're from in the first place,
yeah,
just being caused not by them, in terms of the climate aspect. So yeah, I think it's interesting to me how words, phrases come into circulation and how we are conditioned to see them as natural or neutral or common sense, even though the whole notion of common sense is quite contested.
mm,
And actually, these phrases have been um, created for this purpose. Um, they're not neutral at all. They're actually activating a very particular type of um, relationship to what's happening to our world, our only home, in a way that feels almost invisible.
yeah, absolutely. And I remember before, obviously, the pandemic in 2020, kind of before that, um, the climate crisis was so everywhere. I think it seemed more so prescient at that time. Obviously, it's been seems to be kind of almost buried in under other world crises that we have right now in 2025. So it's something to I certainly sort of try to remember, particularly when you in the audio work that you made, just a reminder that the Thames is, it is coming to be very real, even though obviously in the global south, as you mentioned earlier, things have been very real for quite a long time, and we've displaced the way we've kind of dealt with certain um, um, crisis, or the things that we have um, almost delegated to other countries, maybe countries not as rich as ours, kind of thing. But the climate crisis is definitely coming to our neighborhood, and the Thames, as we know, will be flooded sort of quite imminently. So I think you're calling out the Thames the Thames barrier will not withstand that much longer. I mean, I don't know if you is that something that you kind of want the listener to kind of take note and maybe even take action, or just kind of something in the bigger narrative of how we are living at the moment?
Yeah, this is something that I I kind of almost struggle with in the sense that as an artist, whenever we make something that is about something real, it can the question arises of as to whether it's a form of activism or whether I'm trying to activate people to do something. Whereas I'm just like trying to figure out the world I'm in.
Mm,
Um, if it inspires people to look into things, great, but I'm also not making like posters with information on them. Um, and I don't know whether art has that power anymore.
mm,
Um, there's been a lot of information or, documentaries about Live Aid recently because of the anniversary. And
right.
Live Aid has its own problematics in terms of um, the racial dynamics and the geographical, geopolitical um, dynamics of that initiative. But it also came out at a time when most people had shared sources of information.
Mm,
Most people watch the same kind of news.
mm,
Um, and we're very much not in that time now.
yeah.
So I only have questions for this time. I don't know if I have any answers. But I think with the barrier, what's interesting to me is that from what I can tell and research, it's not so much that it's going to flood, it's that the barrier isn't fit for purpose indefinitely.
Right.
And the question of what to do about that keeps being delayed.
Yes.
And I'm really interested in that quality of delay in the sense that it's almost as if you ignore it, it doesn't exist.
Yeah.
If we keep ignoring it, then it's, when we need it, it may not actually be functional.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and there's something about that that I think is indicative of a kind of cultural um, attitude towards polycrisis to begin with.
Yes.
It's I think I mentioned in the text, like it's in the periphery of view, but it's actually creeping towards us.
Yeah.
And you see in the kind of flooding that's taking place in different parts of Europe that
Mm,
these things happen like that. It's
yeah.
not a gradual build.
Yes.
One day your house is just a house, and the next day your house is underwater. And so, yeah, I think that question of delay, denial, obscuring the meaning of scientific information that's been shared, so turning global warming into climate change,
Yeah.
kind of nullifying and pacifying of language. That's something that I'm really interested in because I think that we live with the effects of that in a way that maybe can be hard to kind of grasp how much we live with the effects of that.
Yeah. I think that's really interesting. And talking about the power of art, I think in terms of or the agency of an artist, within um that kind of approach to not necessarily be sort of calling for activism or being an activist, but actually is making something more present, more kind of focused than it is in the moment, distilling some of the information and misinformation that's out there. I kind of want to jump into something that I know you're really been part of your work for a long time. This sort of
Mm.
I, I might misrepresent it, but speculative fiction and alternative realities. I wonder if you can talk. You mentioned some past work which alluded to some of this approach anyway, but I just wonder whether you want to expand on this approach in making your artwork in general.
Yeah, I mean, speculative fiction is really at the heart of all the work that I make. Um, there's a wonderful speculative writer called Ursula Le Guin, who I'm paraphrasing, but she basically says that speculative fiction is a way for us to kind of rehearse the contemporary. It's a way for us to kind of deal with what's happening to us today.
mm,
but we kind of reflect it through the lens of this imagined future. And I think that's very true. Um, for me, speculative work or working within this kind of broad field of speculation is a way to give myself space to propose different, to imagine different,
mm,
to kind of anticipate what could come as opposed to accepting what we're told is happening. And to propose new ways of being or different ways of being, to kind of suggest an alternate timeline to where we are now. Um, and I think more than anything, I think that's a role that my practice is engaged with, like playing. It's not so much, it's not so much kind of calling attention to now, but using the now to imagine a different future. Um, there's a wonderful Italian philosopher called Franco Berardi. He talks about how kind of late capitalism is stealing our collective ability to imagine different. Because we're always working, even when we're like scrolling on social media, we're working, we're just working for that social media company, not for ourselves and not being paid for it.
right.
And if you think about the kind of, particularly living in London, how much stress people carry,
Mm,
we've had 15 years of austerity, something of that nature. There are all these things that come competing for our attention. And so to kind of reclaim that space of imagination and to actively pursue um, a future or a vision of a future that is an alternative to the path that we're on, I think is a very radical thing to do. And so that's more than anything what my practice is engaged with. And also using the tropes and the freedoms that come with speculative fiction
mm.
in its broadest sense uh, is something that I just find very enjoyable and very satisfying because that I'm a sci-fi and speculative fiction nerd. So I appreciate what my engagement in the world of speculative fiction has given me in terms of the space um, that it allows for my imagination, and that just transmutes through the work as well.
I really like that. I think it's something that I dip in and out of, and I'm very aware of some artists using that as a way to to transgress across different forms and time and space and all
Mm.
those really interesting things that you mentioned. I'm really looking forward to seeing other works from you. And I think I've kind of been following your work on off for quite a long time, so it's really good to be working with you
Likewise.
finally in this commission. And I think I've been listening to this for quite a long time. Your Catching Feels um, um, audio piece for us. I've got one final question, which
Mm.
is so as I mentioned earlier, we have presented your work here um, online, so people can listen to it on their smartphone, on their computer, or wherever they can access the internet, and they can listen to the piece. Um, or they can, and by the way, of course, that could be on the mobile phone walking down the high street here, or somewhere in Kuala Lumpur or South Africa or wherever. It could be very much time shifting or space or place shifting. But we also have these listening posts where people can put on headphones and just be static and listen to something and not do anything else, be focused on listening. Do you have I want to ask you, do you have a preference on how visitors might experience this work?
Yeah, I thought about this. I don't think I do. I think my preference is for the use of headphones wherever you are.
Right.
I think the intimacy of headphones is important to the work. So if possible, I'd recommend using headphones. But I think every listener brings their own. experiences, their own histories, whatever day they're having, they bring it to the work when they put the headphones on. Everyone's going to have their own experience of it, and I'm most intrigued by that. Um, in the sense that the work is remade by each person who listens to it, in the sense, because they might relate to different parts of it, or there might be a sound in it that, you know, resonates is for some reason,
Mm.
or they may not relate to it at all. That's fine as well. But for me, it doesn't matter where you are or when you are, but I
Yeah,
would recommend headphones. I think that kind of intimacy is really um it's a part of it for sure.
brilliant. That's a really good, maybe that's a really good way to end, actually, to ask everyone to experience it through headphones. So
It is.
thank you, Sonia. It's been such a pleasure talking to you again. And yeah, and I'll be looking out for what you do next. Thank you so
Thanks,
much.
Colin. Thank
See you later.
you.
Bye.
Bye.